In the first mini-lecture, we saw how the early Vedic peoples focused on certain hymns to perform as they engaged in their religious rituals. Those texts came to be written down and form the kind of foundation of the Vedas, the voluminous body of religious texts that make up the core of the sacred texts of Hinduism. We went on in the second mini-lecture and we talked about another text where you could see that they are grappling with some other kinds of issues. They're not just the core text itself that is a hymn to a god, but rather they're beginning to be a little more philosophical and frame the existence of the religion in a certain new way. And in the last phase of development of the Vedas, we see a group of texts that are collectively called the Upanishads. The structure of the Vedas is quite complex. If you want, you can look into it, but it is a little complicated. But the gist of it is, over a period of time, we get a bunch of different people that are really developing some very philosophical material. And that's what I want to take a look at now. So the Upanishads, they don't have a single clear and coherent vision that everybody shares. It's not that kind of thing. As I said, it's developing over several centuries, and you have it developing in different places. But what emerges from the product of all of this philosophical thinking is four key sets of ideas that I'll go over briefly, and then you can take a look at them and we'll explore them in class. The first is the idea of Brahman, that there is some kind of an ultimate source, some kind of God, essentially, from which everything comes. I'm not going to read it, but you can read this little bit of text here, and I want you to think about how that relates to the creation stories of the Abrahamic traditions. The next component is Atman. And Brahman and Atman are usually understood in relation to each other. Brahman is the ultimate source, what we in the Abrahamic traditions might call God, though there are some significant differences. Atman are the individual souls, and as you read through this, keep in mind that the basic identity here of Brahman equals Atman, this idea that the ultimate expresses itself, manifests itself as this huge number of infinite souls, but in the end they're not fully separate from the source itself. And so you can see some of the ideas in this section on Atman, and again, we're going to explore it in class, so I don't want to say too much. And then we have ideas of karma connected with rebirth, and then ultimately the final goal, moksha, the liberation from this kind of chain of being born over and over again. And so you've all heard the word karma. I'm sure it's come into the English language. You have some sense of what karma means. Literally, it means action. And so we should understand karma as the kind of fruits of one's actions. You perform certain actions, but the consequences of those actions will carry on. And the basic idea here is that when we die, when our physical body dies, the soul, being immortal, as it is in the Abrahamic traditions, it doesn't simply go to one place, heaven, typical answer for the Abrahamic traditions, but rather, based on how far it is developed in its understanding of the fundamental truth that we just made reference to, the idea that Atman is identical to Brahman. That's to say, our individual soul is ultimately connected with God. But we don't normally realize that, right? We normally think of ourselves as separate. And again, this idea of the ego that has come up repeatedly in the course is really the culprit here, that we focus on our individuality, our separateness from God, and what we are working towards is an understanding of our oneness with God. And so the idea is, when we haven't quite gotten there, then our body dies, our soul is still connected with its level of understanding, and it then is reborn into a new body based on the caste system that we just talked about in the previous mini lecture. And so you can see in this image over here that you have low caste people being born in a low status, that they have minimal understanding, and the idea is that if they live their lives in appropriate ways in accordance with the traditions of the time, that they will fulfill kind of that rung of the ladder, so to speak, and then when they're reborn they might come back a level higher as a Vaishya. And the idea is that as you move through these levels of reincarnation, that you are gradually developing a deeper and deeper understanding of the sacred oneness of all things, your oneness with God. And so when you are close to that, you'll be reborn as a Brahmin. Brahmins have the most access to the sacred texts, and they focus on religious ritual and religious practice, and therefore they are in the best position to attain the final release called moksha. And when you fully realize your oneness with God, there is nothing left over. There is no residual connection to an ego, and therefore no more grasping at rebirth. And instead, one merges with the infinite, likened to a drop of water that is, melts back into the pool of water into which it drops. So we'll talk more about that in class, but that gives you a basic sense of what the foundational ideas are in the Hindu tradition. And when we come back for the next set of mini lectures, we will see how those ideas continue to develop in the history of India.